On the morning of February 9th, 1855, the county of Devon in England woke up to a landscape that should have been impossible. A massive blizzard had passed during the night, leaving the rolling hills and cobblestone streets under a thick, white shroud. But the snow was not pristine. Stretched across 30 separate villages was a single, unbroken trail of cloven hoof-prints. These marks covered nearly 100 miles in a single night. They didn't just follow the roads, they marched over 14-foot walls. They crossed the snowy peaks of high rooftops. They even walked right up to the window ledges of sleeping families, as if something had stood in the dark, staring through the glass. The shape was unmistakable, a perfectly formed cloven hoof. To the people of the Victorian era, this was not a prank. It was the night the devil walked in England. The winter of 1855 was a period of absolute bone-chilling misery for southern England. History remembers it as the Great Frost. For weeks, the ground had been frozen so hard that it rang like iron when struck by a spade. The rivers were clogged with thick chunks of ice, and the birds were reported to be falling dead from the trees. On the night of February 8th, the temperature plummeted further as a freakish, heavy snowfall began to blanket the region. Most people stayed inside, huddled by their hearths, listening to the wind howl off the English Channel. When the sun rose, the world was white and silent, but the peace did not last long. In the town of Exmouth, a local man stepped out of his cottage and stopped dead in his tracks. There, pressed into the fresh, deep snow, was a line of prints. They were small, roughly 4 inches long and 3 inches wide. They looked exactly like the hoof of a small donkey or a pig. As he followed them, his confusion turned into a cold, crawling dread. The prints were not staggered like a normal 4-legged animal. They were in a perfectly straight, single-file line. Each step was spaced exactly 8 to 16 inches apart. It was as if a creature was walking on 2 legs with a singular robotic purpose. And it wasn't just Exmouth. As the morning progressed, reports began to flood in from Topsham, Dawlish, Teignmouth, and even as far as Totnes. The trail was everywhere. It spanned the entire width of the Exe estuary. The logistics of the trail are what keep historians and researchers awake at night. If this were a prank, it would be the most sophisticated and physically demanding hoax in human history. The tracks moved with a disregard for gravity and architecture that defies logic. In Topsham, a woman reported that the prints came right up to her front door, stopped for a moment, and then continued on top of a 6-foot stone wall. There were no marks of a struggle or a climb, no scuffs in the snow. The creature had simply moved from the ground to the top of the wall as if it was stepping over a pebble. In another part of the country, the tracks were found on the roofs of houses that were over 20 feet high. Imagine the scene for a Victorian family. You are sleeping in your bed, protected by your thick stone walls and your heavy wooden doors, but just a few feet above your head, something with cloven hooves is pacing across your shingles in the middle of a blizzard. One of the most famous reports from that morning involved a haystack. The prints led directly to the side of a massive, frozen stack of hay. Instead of walking around it, the prints seemed to pass right through it. They reappeared on the exact opposite side in the same straight line, without the hay being disturbed or moved. Then there was the crossing of the River Exe. At the point where the tracks reached the water, the estuary is 2 miles wide. The prints walked right through the edge of the freezing, slushy tide. On the far bank, in the exact same trajectory and with the same perfect spacing, the trail picked up again and headed into the woods. There were no boat marks. There were no bridges nearby. Whatever made those marks had either walked on the water or glided through the air. By the afternoon of February 9th, the atmosphere in Devon had shifted from curiosity to total hysteria. This was a deeply religious and superstitious time. The Crimean War was occupying the news, and people were already on edge. The sight of a cloven hoof, the ancient symbol of the great enemy, was too much for many to handle. Groups of men in villages like Dawlish and Teignmouth gathered together. They were farmers and labourers who believed their families were in mortal danger. They armed themselves with pitchforks, old hunting muskets, and heavy clubs. They followed the tracks into the deep, wooded valleys of the countryside, hoping to corner the beast. But they found nothing. The tracks would often lead to the thickest, most tangled parts of the forest and then simply vanish. In some cases, the trail would stop in the middle of a wide, open field where the snow was untouched for 100 yards in every direction. There were no exit prints. There were no signs of a struggle. The creature had simply ceased to exist on the physical plane. The local clergy did not help the situation. Rather than offering a rational explanation, many vicars took to their pulpits to declare that the marks were a divine warning. They told their congregations that the devil was literally walking among them, marking the homes of the unfaithful. This led to a wave of religious fervour. People who hadn't been to church in years were suddenly found praying in the pews, terrified that the hoof-prints would appear on their window ledges next. When the story reached the intellectual circles of London, the Victorian scientific community tried to provide an answer that didn't involve the supernatural. They were embarrassed by the devil rumours and wanted to put the matter to rest with biology and physics. One of the first theories suggested a group of escaped kangaroos. A local nobleman had a private menagerie, and the rumour was that a few had broken out during the storm. The Reverend Musgrave tried to push this theory to calm his parish. He argued that a kangaroo's tail and hind legs might leave a mark in the snow that looked like a hoof. But the people of Devon knew what a kangaroo was. They knew that a kangaroo doesn't walk in a single file line for 100 miles. They also knew that a kangaroo would likely die of hypothermia within an hour of escaping into a Devon blizzard. Then came the atmospheric balloon theory. Some researchers believe that an experimental balloon had broken its moorings at the Devonport dockyard. They suggested that a heavy mooring chain or a shackle was hanging from the bottom of the balloon. As the wind blew the craft across the county, the chain would bounce along the ground, stamping the snow. This would explain how the marks crossed over walls and rivers. However, there were no records of any lost balloons that night. Furthermore, a dragging chain doesn't leave a clean, vertical hoof print. It leaves a long, messy furrow. It doesn't walk onto a roof and pause at a window. The most famous scientist of the era, Richard Owen, also stepped in. He was the man who coined the word dinosaur. He argued that the tracks were made by badgers. He suggested that because the snow had partially melted and then refrozen, the paw prints of a badger had expanded and distorted into the shape of a hoof. But this theory ignored the sheer distance. A badger is a small, heavy animal. It cannot cover 100 miles in one night. It certainly cannot walk across the top of a frozen river or navigate the rooftops of 30 different villages. If we look at this through a modern lens, the mystery only gets deeper. In 1994, the researcher Mike Dash performed an exhaustive study of all the primary sources from 1855. He found that the reports were remarkably consistent. Thousands of people, many of whom had never met each other, described the exact same phenomenon. Could it have been a mass hallucination? Unlikely. Hallucinations don't leave physical marks in the snow that can be measured with a ruler. Could it have been a coordinated hoax? To pull this off in 1855, you would need dozens of people equipped with specialized tools, all working in total darkness during a deadly blizzard, covering 100 miles of terrain without being seen. They would have to climb houses and cross rivers in the freezing cold. And for what purpose? No one ever stepped forward to take credit. No one ever confessed on their deathbed. The mystery was briefly brought back to life in March of 2009. A woman in North Devon woke up to find a trail of 5-inch hoof prints in her back garden after a light snowfall. The prints were in a single file line, and had the same cloven shape described in 1855. Once again, the experts were called. Once again, they suggested everything from hares to hopping mice. And once again, the explanation didn't quite fit the physical evidence. The devil's footprint remains one of the most well-documented anomalies in British history. It wasn't a ghost sighting in a dark room or a tall tale told by a single drunkard in a pub. It was a massive, physical event that left its mark on an entire region. Whatever crossed Devon that night didn't care about stone walls. It didn't care about the freezing water of the estuary. It moved with a terrifying, quiet confidence through the heart of a storm. It left a trail that was meant to be seen, a signature in the snow that has lasted nearly 2 centuries.